you've done a lot of work on fear. That was one of the things that you mentioned before. Is there something that everybody is scared of? Because I've heard the story, the wives' tale, babies are born with, is it fears of heights and loud noises or something? Is there any truth in that, or is there something everyone's scared of?
There is. I think the one that everybody who has a healthy nervous system will react quite robustly to is if you start increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that they're breathing and reduce the amount of oxygen that they're taking in. That's terrifying.
Am I right in thinking there's a experiment you can do where it's a single breath, and that is pretty reliable at bringing on an anxiety attack?
Yeah, if you have people, please don't do this because you need the right proper medical staff around, but they're great experiments of having people breathe carbon dioxide directly, and you basically panic. It's terrifying. One big gulp of carbon dioxide will make you very afraid. It turns out that there are a little group of neurons, of course neurons are just nerve cells, that little group of neurons in the brainstem that respond to levels of carbon dioxide in the blood. Turns out the reason we breathe is, of course, to bring in oxygen and then offload carbon dioxide. But we don't have neurons that stimulate breathing for oxygen. We have neurons that sense when carbon dioxide levels get too high. So if you hold your breath, eventually carbon dioxide levels go up. And then at the moment that they reach a certain threshold, these neurons fire and trigger the gasp reflex. So in that moment, you bring in oxygen, and then of course you offload some carbon dioxide.
That's why it's so important to work on CO2 tolerance, right, for breath work.
Yeah, so free divers, a sport I actually don't recommend because there's only one way out of that sport, as they say. I have some friends who are free divers, and obviously you can do it safely with the right guide and training, et cetera, but it is a very dangerous sport because for most people, when carbon dioxide levels increase in the bloodstream and brain, it triggers this gasp reflex. What free divers train is carbon dioxide tolerance. So they do that a couple of different ways. And again, please don't do this because people have died doing this. So one way is you can do what's called cyclic hyperventilation. Right? You do that 25 times or so, and you think, oh, you're bringing in a lot of oxygen. You are, but you're also offloading a lot of carbon dioxide, especially if you use forceful exhales. Normally humans breathe through active inhales and passive exhales. They just sort of dump their air passively. But if you do cyclic hyperventilation, you're dumping a lot of carbon dioxide. And then if you were to hold your breath, what you would find is you could hold your breath for a lot longer. Why? Because your carbon dioxide levels are reduced, so you don't have the same impulse to breathe. Now on land, that's a more or less safe thing to do, provided that you can get a good gulp of air once the gasp reflex hits. If you do that before going underwater, cyclic hyperventilation, they call it air packing, and then you go underwater, you're going to be able to, cyclic hyperventilation to air pack and then go underwater, but your carbon dioxide is then lower, you're going to be able to stay under longer. But this is very dangerous because normally when that carbon dioxide threshold hits, you would pop up to the surface, you sort of panic and want to go to the top. Free divers learn to tolerate high levels of carbon dioxide in their bloodstream and stay very, very calm. The way they die is very interesting because it speaks to the physiology. The way they die is they'll just be swimming, feeling completely calm because they're very used to, they've trained up this CO2 tolerance, carbon dioxide tolerance. And when they die, they don't suddenly feel like, oh my goodness, I'm running out of air. It's just lights go black. That's it, they're just blackout. And so they're alive and then they're gone. And so this is why they use spotters, they have a line, et cetera. Anytime you hear about somebody dying doing free diving, it's rarely because they weren't comfortable at a given depth or because they've never been to that depth.
Their gasp reflex has kicked in, it's because their gasp reflex has been so desensitized that it's after the point at which they die.
Precisely. And this, it's sort of like when you hear that skilled parachuters die. Why? Well, because they're so comfortable with so many jumps, they actually forget to pull. There are many instances in which they're videoing the first-time jumpers, right? And they're getting the video for them, and they themselves forget to pull because they're so comfortable jumping out of planes. And so, as people get more and more advanced in something, there's a new risk that surfaces because unless it's very reflexive and they built all the protocols in, oftentimes they can overlook the very thing that allowed them to become expert in the first place.
Why do my palms get sweaty when I watch videos of people climbing up cranes and stuff like that? You know the ones that I mean? The guy's got a GoPro. There's a dude called James Kingston from the UK that's a psychopath. He goes up to the highest towers of Dubai illegally in the middle of the night, and then I watch it on a screen that's only this big, and I get this visceral response.
Yeah, well, two things. First of all, I can relate. You know, I saw the Free Solo movie with Alex Honnold, and you know he lives, and it's still scary to watch, right? You actually know the outcome at the beginning. They sort of make it clear that he manages to do this, and it's still terrifying. And I think it's for the same reason that those YouTube videos are terrifying, which is that we are so visual as animals. We are so visual. I mean, rodents, even a lot of carnivore predators are extremely olfactory, smell driven. Humans are incredibly visual. I mean, more than 40% of the human brain has something to do with vision, visual navigation, eye movements, visual perception, color perception, face perception. We have dedicated areas of the brain that are just for perceiving human faces and the micro expressions of human faces. So it's so highly evolved for us. When we see depth of field that's not parallel to the ground, it is terrifying with good reason, because you know, what's the universal force that we all experience from the time we're born? Is gravity. The first thing you learn is that things fall down, not up, right? It's like the fundamental rule that we come into the world with. It's like day one, even though the baby is kind of flopping around like a potato bug, can't even hold its head up, eyes are often, you know, the ocular muscles of the eyes are often not very good, so babies, their eyes are rolling back in their head. That generally corrects itself over the next few weeks or so. But the feeling of gravity of them, you know, if they feel like they're being dropped even the tiniest bit, right, they will go wide-eyed. So there's a built-in vestibulo-ocular reflex. So when you see depth of field in the direction of the gravitational pull, you actually get a little bit of activity in your cerebellum, which literally means mini brain, a little area of the brain in the back that actually looks like a little mini brain if you were looking at the brain. And that area of the brain is responsible for all the reflexes associated with the falling reflex. It does a lot of other things too. So when you see that depth of field in the direction of gravity, you have a little microactivity in your brain that you might fall. And if you've ever been to a tall bridge or a dam and you go to the edge, and you know, people love to play with this. There's also that tower in Toronto. They have the big
Sears Tower?
Well, the big tower in Toronto, I forget what it is. Maybe it's in Calgary. Goodness. Canadians are going to hate me.
Okay.
I love Canadians, but for some reason I can't remember this. But they have one of those glass floors there where you can walk, and it's terrifying, and you know you're not going to fall through it, right? Or they tell you you're not going to fall through it. But it's terrifying because your body and brain are preparing for this immense fall. So when you see this in video, it's the same thing. I always say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a video is worth 10 million pictures. I mean, this is the reason why we're so drawn to things like Instagram scrolling. It's like text, video, you know, or the enormous popularity of TikTok. It's video. Now, the enormous popularity of Twitter still escapes me because that's a different sort of cultural gravitational pull. But video, and in particular action that gets us in a kind of a primitive mode, that is an extremely alluring visual image.
What about emotional fears, like fear of failure or social disapproval or something? Do they work in a similar way, or is there a different part of the brain that's using that? Yeah,
great question. So a few years ago, a postdoc in my lab, who's now a staff scientist, Dr. Melise Yilmaz-Balban, she has a long name, excellent researcher, studies fear, did a very broad-scale survey of the general public, thousands and thousands of entries, created this kind of cloud of bubbles. The bigger the bubble, the greater number of people that had that fear. We saw some interesting things. So heights, certainly. Public speaking, certainly. Doctor's office and syringes, certainly. Public speaking fear is very common. Social isolation fear is very common. But we also saw some things like dogs. You know, there are a number of people who are afraid of dogs, which is inconceivable to me because I love dogs so much.
Exactly the same.
Yep. But people form these associations, whether or not through experience or through indirect experience, observing others. I think public speaking is one of the greatest. Fear of dying. You know, it's funny. It's not funny, but figure of speech. I never think about dying and being afraid of dying. I think about all the scary things that could happen while I'm living. But there are many people who are just intrinsically afraid of dying. And so that's a big one. For people that don't swim, fear of drowning. For people that swim, less so. For people that have some sort of psychiatric disorder, genuine psychiatric disorder, like obsessive compulsive disorder, which is not just obsessive compulsive personality, but obsessive compulsive disorder, fear of being discovered and the shame that they have around their obsessions and compulsions. These are true OCD is very common.
Do they all live in the same place? All of these different fears, are they all existing in the same place?
So I was rattling off, and I didn't answer your question to the more important point, so forgive me. The short answer is they have a final common pathway, which is increased autonomic arousal, and that is funneled through a couple what we call limbic structures, among others. So there's certainly involvement of the now famous amygdala, which means almond, is this almond-shaped structure on the two sides of the brain. There's also an area of the brain called the stria terminalis that's also involved in fear. And then the hypothalamus, this small collection of neurons just above the roof of your mouth, which is really, to me, one of the more fascinating areas of the brain, harbors neurons that create a body-wide and brain-wide response to something that the higher order areas of the brain, like the forebrain, see and perceive as dangerous, as threatening. So the short answer is yes, it all funnels through hypothalamus, amygdala, stria terminalis, and autonomic nervous system. That's a final common pathway. But in terms of the variety of different things that can stimulate fear and the ways that they can do that, that is highly contextual. So the forebrain, this real estate in the brain right behind the forehead, is incredible because it's sort of free real estate for you to customize for your life, according to what happens to you early on. So for instance, you might not be at all afraid of heights. And you say, well, why is that so? Well, maybe when you were a kid, you were one of those maniacs that liked, doing, in the States, we call them cherry drops, the kids that could, swing on their feet and then jump off the bar. And then other kids are timidly crawling to the top of the thing, don't even want to go up the ladder to the slide. There's a ton of variation, and that variation does not exist in the kind of deeper circuitry, the final common path circuitry. It exists in the learning that we experienced early in life. One bad fall can do it. I mean, I was bitten very badly by a German Shepherd when I was a kid. Head almost got my eye, but for whatever reason, I've always liked dogs anyway. But there are other things that I've experienced that have left long-term negative imprints. So it's highly contextual, and a lot of it has to do with what happens immediately after the bad experience. This is why nowadays there's a lot of legal use of the drug ketamine after traumas. This is all very dark stuff, unfortunately. But if you just imagine the family member that was just in a car crash and saw the driver, their loved one, impaled onto the steering column. I mean, what could be more horrible than that? Nowadays, if they come into the emergency room, they will often give them an injection of ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic, to get them to dissociate from this extreme emotional state. So there are ways now to treat this, and ketamine is used clinically at later periods too.
Didn't you did an experiment where you went diving with sharks, and I think that there was a complication, and you went back the next day to redo it. I'm going to guess that this is for the exact same reason, to sort of conquer and integrate the experience. Yeah.
To make a long story short, we went 2 years in a row out to Guadalupe Island, where there are a lot of great white sharks. Some of the more expert shark divers were cage exiting. They were leaving the cage. The first year I did not. The second year I decided I would, but the day before I did, I went down into the cage, just get comfortable again down there, and I had air failure, and the safety tanks were out also, and obviously I experienced extreme carbon dioxide overload and panic. I didn't full-blown panic. I kept enough awareness that I was able to, obviously I'm here. I survived doing a share air protocol, et cetera, but it was a very bad situation. I don't like to say I nearly died because that's actually sort of letting the bug in my brain. I like to joke that the Reaper came in and offered me a fist bump, and I offered him a different gesture instead. So I survived, but the next day I woke up very, very distraught because I had this this loop in my brain. This notion that I came so close to the end. And so I did go back down and I did cage exit. And I don't say that to suggest that it was the smartest decision. Obviously, you're safer on the boat or on land. I don't say it to sound, again, tough or anything. I did it deliberately because I did not want to return home with this loop of fear. And so I went back into the traumatic circumstance and obviously made it out. And if you look at all the successful treatments for trauma, they all involve getting close to the trauma-inducing mindset. Exposure therapy gradual and assisted by a clinician, but rarely, if ever, are people with serious trauma encouraged to get as far away from the feeling of, at least not in the clinical setting. This has a lot of implications for things like trigger warnings. Colleagues of mine in psychiatry, I've asked them directly, what do you think of trigger warnings? And they said, there's some logic to it on the surface, but if you really think about true trauma, and we can define trauma. Dr. Paul Conti was on my podcast, is amazing trauma psychiatrist. He said trauma is an experience, is not just a bad experience. Trauma is an experience that changes your nervous system such that it behaves differently in the future, in a way that's maladaptive for you. So if you look at all the trauma treatments, they're all about learning to talk about the trauma, even experiencing some of the same feelings. So things like trigger warnings and all these things that buffer us against feeling our true feelings do nothing but prolong the trauma and prolong and exacerbate fear.
You had David Goggins in the lab to study him for fear. What did you learn from looking at that guy?
Yeah, David's great. I always chuckle with David because, the one thing about David is what you see on social media is actually what you get when you interact with David. We worked long hours one day and everyone was ready to tap out. This was a bunch of people in Silicon Valley for a day, doing some workshop type thing. And he was changing into his running shorts midway. He was going to run to the airport and he ran to the airport as far as I know.
To get his flight?
I believe so, but there was this moment of, should we continue? Should we take a break? And he was like, no, let's keep going. Everything you see and read and hear about David is exactly how he shows up. It's really wonderful. He came to the lab and he did, we have a virtual version of the shark thing, which of course is not the same as the real experience. But for people who are afraid of sharks, it's quite scary for them and allows us to study fear. He's very afraid of sharks, which was sort of amusing to me, given that as a SEAL, he had to spend a lot of time in water. But he was first one in, wanted to do the VR, talked about how he didn't like it, but that's why he did it. Constant testing himself. In fact, I think even though David's quite successful, and has many, many options of how to spend his time, I believe this is correct. I think right now he's doing fire jumping. He's fighting fires in the wilderness by zip lining in or fast lining in or jumping out of planes. So he's constantly pushing that friction lever to create or build or further build this thing about leaning into friction. And this is a term that isn't really scientific, but that I decided to coin because this idea of limbic friction, that when we're very tired and we need to be in action, or when we're very stressed and we need to perform in a more calm and controlled way, there's friction on both sides. Getting out of bed when we're exhausted, hard, very hard often. Leaning into action in a calm and deliberate way when we're freaking out, like going to give a public lecture if one has fear of public speaking, also hard. So this limbic friction, and David just seems to seek what I call limbic friction in every domain of life.
Is that like exposure therapy for limbic friction then?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, what you're training and improving when you're getting better at dealing with stress is this ability to tolerate high amounts of adrenaline in your body and to think clearly and function well. I mean, adrenaline is epinephrine, and just a little bit of physiology. It's released from the adrenals, obviously, above the kidneys. That gets your body organs amped up and energized. It can't cross the so-called blood-brain barrier. You have a high-restriction fence that we call the blood-brain barrier around the brain. Keep bad molecules out. Adrenaline, therefore, is released also within the brain from a little cluster of neurons called locus ceruleus. The name doesn't matter. So when you are stressed, your brain and your body both wake up, and that adrenaline hijacks certain systems, narrows your visual focus, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at almost all stress inoculation protocols, cold water, ice bath, cold shower, cyclic hyperventilation, those all do the same thing. They generate a lot of adrenaline release in the brain and a lot of adrenaline release in the body. But it's different if the adrenaline in the brain and body is evoked by you, that you did it. Because under conditions under which you did the ice bath deliberately and now you're wide awake and really, really alert, there's this feeling that you have options. It wasn't done to you, but you can train up an ability to, for instance, think clearly and calmly. Maybe even do some simple math problems in your head, or maybe try and relax while there's all this adrenaline in your system. And that carries over so that when we've all done it, you're driving along, the person in front of you stops short, and you're almost in the accident, right? There's that moment where you could panic, or that moment where you could, road rage or that moment where you could freak out. But if you are familiar with the feeling of adrenaline in your brain and body, you navigate that in a calmer way. How? Well, because adrenaline is generic. There's no adrenaline for the car crash, adrenaline for the heights, adrenaline for the relationship situation. It's all the same. So we can get better. We can raise our stress threshold, as I like to refer to it. And that can be done through cold water or cyclic hyperventilation, ideally not at the same time. But cold water, is a universal stimulus for creating adrenaline release. And there's a big range of cold, not infinite, but a big range of cold in which you can generate adrenaline without harming your tissue. Whereas with heat, you get into a very hot environment or very low oxygen environment, you'll also get a lot of adrenaline, but you can also suffocate and burn yourself. So this is why cold is used in Navy SEAL screening and training. And this is why I think so many people really like the ice bath and cold showers. It has a bunch of other positive effects, but it is a great trigger for adrenaline.